So he's saying that.
All right, we'll say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's shir. To thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, the Tilsim Mishpach of Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all the Shir and Drashos this year as a zechus for Besoros Tavos for Am Yisrael. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Iyar Haba Aleinu L'Tova, Shmuel and Rabbi Karabkin, the creation of the arts, of Shmuel's father, Lipa Ben Yecheskel Kohen Zichron Livracha, and our week of learning sponsors, Hillary Jacobs in Kent, in memory of her daughter Shifra Zichron Livracha, Bas Chana Dina. Our Daf Yomi sponsor for today, Rezi Eskin, Lezecha Nishmas, her husband Bill Eskin, Yoel Yisrael Ben Mordechai Zichron Livracha, whose yahrzeit is on the 23rd of Iyar, and who very much loved attending the Daf Yomi shir. Meretz Hashem, we hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Slab and Aliyah, the families in Nechama, all those who need to refuah Shabbat together with Kol Chole Yisrael. Kadosh Baruch Hu should the Meretz Hashem bring home all of our hostages and allow our holy soldiers to be successful. B'chol Maasei Yedehem. So with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today. Baruch Hashem, today's daf is Chof Beis 22. We are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Chaf Aleph Beis 21b, 12 lines from the top. Rabbi Akiva. So the Gemara says as follows. Rabbi Akiva says, Shevuos shelo ochal v'achal kol shu chayiv. So remember again in the Mishnah, we had the following case. I make a shvuah, I swear I'm not going to eat this loaf of bread. And then I eat a little bit of it, right? So that's a little bit as defined less than a kizayis. Rabbi Akiva says that I am chayiv. So he says I'm chayiv. Achal kol shu, even if you consume a very minute amount, Rabbi Akiva holds that I'm chayiv. Okay, so asks the Gemara, Rabbi Akiva b'chol Torah kuluk Rabbi Shimon Svirlei the mechai b'mashu. So we'll say here's the shaila. When Rabbi Akiva, now this is, of course is very unique because in general, whenever we have an isur achila, a prohibition to eat something, generally the shear is a kizayis. And of course here Rabbi Akiva is saying that Allah Chalamayse, if I make a shvuah not to eat a loaf of bread and I eat even a small minute amount, I'm chayiv. So the shaila is like this. Is this Rabbi Akiva's shita by Shevuos, right? Is this what he does? Is this something unique by a Shevuah? Or generally what we call like Gans Torah? Just in general, Rabbi Akiva holds like the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, which we'll see in just a moment. And Rabbi Shimon holds that in general, with even a regular Isser Achila, even a general consumption prohibition, you are chayiv if you consume even a minute amount. So that's the shayla on Rabbi Akiva. So says the Gemara. So the sign of Rabbi Shimon, what's Rabbi Shimon say? Rabbi Shimon says, Kol shehu lamakas. In general, if you consume any amount of a prohibited item, you'll get malchus. Amru kizayis al inyan carbon. The shear of kizayis is a shear for carbon. So this is the position of Rabbi Shimon, which of course in general we reject. But halacha l'maisa, again, this is the position of Rabbi Shimon. So the shaila is, does Rabbi Akiva general agree with Rabbi Shimon, and therefore anytime there's an Isra Achila, the prohibition is b'mashu, any amount, or no, this is just a general halacha, unique halacha by Shvuah, but doesn't apply by the rest of the Torah. But then who? So in general, Rabbi Akiva could have argued on the Rabbanon even in a general sense, right? In any area of Torah. The reason why the machlokes is espoused here, to teach you the strength of the Rabbanon's position. Remember again, because the Rabbanon hold that even in a case of Shevuah, the shear is still going to be a kezayis. So therefore, I will say this is our fundamental shayla. Rabbi Akiva in the Mishnah is saying, I make a shvuah not to eat this loaf of bread. If I eat any amount of the loaf, Rabbi Akiva says, I am liable. What does Rabbi Akiva hold in the rest of Torah? Same thing, that you're chayiv for any amount of prohibited consumption? Or no, here by shvuah it's unique, but in general he holds kizayis. Okay, so the Gemara says, I'm sorry, Bahad the kamifli yacha lo diacha kochan drabanan da'afagav deikal meimar hoil umefaresh chayiv stam nami chayiv. So we'll say perhaps over here, perhaps Rabbi Akiva argues really in the entire Torah, and the reason why halacha say it's mentioned over here is to highlight to us the strength of the Rabbanon's position. And according to the Rabbanon, you are not chayiv unless, of course, you go ahead and consume a kizayis. Now, what's unique? Now, also, we're going to see over here in the case of Shevuah, right? For example, if you were to go ahead and say, Shevuah she'eni ochal mashu shel kikar zu, I swear I'm not going to eat any amount from this loaf. Then what's the halacha? If you go ahead and you eat any amount, you are in fact liable. So I might have thought that halacha l'maisa, that the reason that even if I'm not mefarish, even if I don't explicitly articulate that, perhaps I should be liable even for consumption of any amount. So the Gemara says, therefore the Rabbanan say, no, that's not the case. The Rabbanan will say, in general, if you make a shvur not to eat something, the shear is going to be a kizayis. If you go ahead and you say, I swear not to eat any amount, then einachinami, liability vests upon any amount. So perhaps just coming to highlight the strength of that particular position. Okay, Odoma, or perhaps, Ba'alma kirabanan svirle, maybe in general, Rabbi Akiva holds like the Rabbanan, means that throughout the rest of the Torah, whenever there is an Isra Achila is always a kizayis. V'hacha hainu taima hoyel umefarish chayiv stam nami chayiv. And here, Rabbi Akiva holds a little bit differently. So I will say, so again, if you would go with this idea that in general Rabbi Akiva holds that that an Isra Achila is a kizayis, so why in Shevuos should you be chayiv if you consume even a minute amount? And the Lachapana would be as follows. Since in a case of Shevuos, there is the ability to go ahead and prohibit even a mashahu, perhaps what that does is that tells you all cases of Shevuos, by definition, are an Isser mashahu. That's the logic. Since there is a construct where mashu could become, where even a minute amount could become prohibited, perhaps that becomes our default setting in any case of Shevuos which prohibits consumption. Okay, so we'll say, so this is our shaila. So Tashma, so let's analyze this. We'll say, so again, let's take what we know. What do we know? We know that by Shevuos, Rabbi Akiva holds that if I swear not to eat this loaf of bread, then what's the halacha? If I consume even a mashu, any amount, I am liable. What's our shaila? Is this Rabbi Akiva's unique position by Shevuos, but by the rest of Torah, he agrees that the shear is a kizayis? Or perhaps no, he holds like Rabbi Shimon, even by the rest of Torah, who holds that in general, any prohibition of consumption is a mashu, right? All you need to consume is a minute amount for malchus. The only time kizayis comes up is really for carbonic liability. That's our shaila. So let's analyze. So Tashma, Damlo Rabbi Akiva. So they said in the Mishnah, remember this is now recording the actual conversation in the Mishnah. Damlo Rabbi Akiva, Heichan matzinu ba'ochal kol shehu, shu chayiv, shezeh chayiv. So they said to Rabbi Akiva in the Mishnah, Rabbi Akiva, what do you mean that you're chayiv for a mashuhu for Shevuos? After all, where in the rest of Torah do we ever find a case where you're chayiv for consuming a minute amount? To which the Gemara says, V'im Isa. Now, if Rabbi Akiva really held like Rabbi Shimon in the entire Torah, Leima lahu ana b'chol haTorah kuluk Rabbi Shimon sfirale. So really, Rabbi Akiva should have said, if Rabbi Akiva held like Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Akiva should have said to them, Chavra, what are you talking about? I hold this way in the entire Torah. This is my position. I hold like Rabbi Shimon. Right? And Rabbi Shimon holds that in general, and there's an Isser Mashahu with any Isser Achila. To which the Gemara says, you're right, L'divrei d'Rabbanan ka'amar lahun. Really, Rabbi Akiva ultimately is addressing his words to the position of the Rabbanan. How so? He said like this, Lididi b'chol haTorah kuluk Rabbi Shimon sfirli. So Rabbi Akiva is like this, really, if you're asking me, right, I hold like Rabbi Shimon in the entire Torah, and therefore every Isser Achila is an Isser b'mashahu, any amount. However, the Gemara says, "L'didachu odu l'miha hoil umefarish chayiv stam nami chayiv." So we keep says, Rabbanan, I know you're going to disagree with me in the rest of the Torah, but at least in Shevuos, agree with me. Why? Let's agree that in Shevuos, since there's the possibility to explicitly articulate a mashahu, right, that even a minute amount should be aser, let's make that the default setting in Shevuos, and therefore anytime you swear not to eat something, by definition you prohibit even a minute amount. And the Rabbanan say, no. The Rabbanan say, no, we don't hold that way. We hold that the shir is a kizayis in all areas of halacha. Okay, so we haven't resolved it. Tashma, Rabbi Kiva, this is a very interesting case here. Rabbi Kiva Omer, Nazir, Sheshara Pito Bayayin, V'yesh Ba Kedei Letzaref Kizayis Chayiv. So we'll say a very interesting case over. You have a Nazir. Obviously, a Nazir is not permitted to go ahead and drink wine. So look what our Nazir does. Our Nazir goes ahead and he has wine, but he has bread also. He soaks the bread in the wine, and the bread-wine combination combines to form a kizayis. So there's not enough wine to generate liability, right? But the bread combined with the wine creates a kizayis. Look at Rashi. Rashi says, "V'yishpa kedei letzaref kizayis bein pas v'yayin." It's the last, second to last short line in Rashi. Chayiv teheter mitzaref le'iser b'isuri nazir diafin le'im mishras. So again, you have Rabbi say, now what's unique about this? In this case over here, remember it's the wine that's prohibited. The bread is totally fine. Bread is fine, but yet again, halacha l'maisa. Halacha l'maisa, the bread combines with the wine to form the shear. So it says, Rabbi Yisrael now if Rabbi Akiva holds like Rabbi Shimon, right? Namely, that's what? That anytime you have an Isra Achila, it's always b'mashahu, it's always even in a minute amount, then why the need to combine? Right? In other words, then really any minute amount of wine should be prohibited to the Nazir. Why do I have to get up to the threshold of a kizayis through combining the bread with the wine? Furthermore, let's say a person made a shvuah, just a general shvuah. I swear I'm not going to eat. I swear I'm not going to eat. And what happens? And then he ends up eating, I mean, hopefully not all at once, right? But he ends up eating the velas, trefash, katzim, v'ramasim, which I will say, by the way, is interesting. You think to yourself, how could it be that a person takes a shvuah not to eat, and they end up eating all of this stuff? So I will say, it's a tremendous musar, how you could see a person making a shvuah not to eat. Maybe a person overindulges. Maybe a person has a bit too much excess, so they say, you know what? I need to get my life back on the right course. So sometimes in the quest for spiritual growth, a person has to be very conscious of extremism and recognizing that sometimes going to the extreme is not the right approach because you end up failing. And not only do you fail, you crash and burn. And this happens all the time in Ruchnius, right? All the time in Ruchnius. We get very excited, and like it's 0 to 60 under 3 seconds. And then one day we wake up like, oh my God, what did I do over here? And there's like a panic, and that panic comes sometimes, results like in, spirituality remorse. And then like just the pendulum swings back the other way. Now, what I do want to point out, the Rambam brings this down in Hilchos Deos. The Rambam says that sometimes in order to correct a character flaw, in order to correct a lifestyle flaw, sometimes I have to do something extreme, right? I have to swing the pendulum all the way to the other way, with the hope and expectation that then I come back to the derech hamemutza. I come back to the middle path. So sometimes you need an extreme shift in order to gravitate to the middle. But more often than not, extreme shifts don't work. More than that, extreme shifts have a tendency to backfire. So incredibly enough, like in this case over here, this guy making a shvuah shelo ochal, and then what happens? He eats shkatzim, ramasim, nevelas, and shefas. Just a tremendous mosar skill. And anyway, but back to the halacha of this. So a guy takes a shvuah not to eat anything, and then he ends up eating nevelas, shefas, shkatzim, ramasim, chayiv. Ultimately, again, he's going to be chayiv. He's going to be chayiv. Rashi says over here, karban shvuah. Rabbi Shimon poter. Rabbi Shimon says that you're poter. And I both say that. Why does Rabbi Shimon say that you're poter? Take a look at Rashi. First wide line in Rashi. Rabbi Shimon poter. Shrei mushva ba'omed mehar Sinai ala nevelos ve'in shvua chala al mitzvah. So also we're going to see. We've referenced this concept many times, but haven't actually seen the sugya yet, which is as follows: the concept of mushva ba'omed. If you take a shvuah on something that you are already obligated to do or not to do, that shvuah essentially is meaningless. So therefore, Rabbi Shimon will say, if I take a shvuah not to eat, and I end up eating non-kosher items, prohibited items, Rabbi Shimon says, I'm not chayiv. I'm chayiv for consumption of non-kosher items. What am I not chayiv for? Violation of my shvuah. Why? Because my shvuah never devolved upon those items. Why not? Because I was already adjured. I was already obligated in that. So a shvuah cannot devolve upon something you are already obligated to do. So Rabbi Shimon says, you eat nevelas, sheva, shkatzim, v'ramosim. Ultimately, again, we'll say, there's like a similar concept to this. I forgot I think there's a legal term for this. Like if, imagine for a moment that the Chas Shalom is a missing person, and somebody puts up a reward, $250,000 if you help find this missing person. And a police officer finds the missing person, I believe that the halacha is that the police officer is not entitled to the reward, right? Why? Because like he's mushra omed, like it's his job. That's not the technical term, mushra omed. But again, it's the same yisod. If you're already obligated to do something, then halacha l'maisa, the external process doesn't devolve upon you. So therefore, again, I take a shvuah not to eat. If I eat shkatzim v'ramas, I'm chayiv. I want to be clear. I'm chayiv for violating a law of eating non-kosher items, but I'm not chayiv for violating my shvuah because my shvuah never devolved upon those items. Okay, so the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, Vavinan ba. But we said, why? Vavinan ba amai chayiv Rabbi Shimon. Why does Rabbi Shimon say that you're chayiv? Mushva mehar Sinaihu. You're already a juror. You're already obligated not to eat these items from Har Sinai. So Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Tarvayu, bekolol dvarim hamutarim im dvarim ha'asurim. So we're going to see this a number of different times. That halacha l'maisa, you're right. Had a person just said, I swear not to eat nevelos, treifos, shkatzim, v'ramasim, such a shvuah would be essentially would just be meaningless, because again, I'm already prohibited not to eat those items. However, there's something called a shvuah kola, which means, or an isser kola, which means that halacha l'maisa, if I prohibit other permitted items, so then the shvuah could devolve even upon prohibited items. In other words, so since when I say shvuah shelo ochal, what am I including in that? All foods, including what? Permitted foods. So we say once the shvuah could devolve upon permitted foods, it could also go ahead and devolve upon prohibited items as well. Rashi says over here, "B'kol dvarim hamutarim," second white line, "Kilomar im hayon nishpa al nevelos levadan lo haisa shvuah chala." So, however, so obviously, if a person just took a shvuah not to eat nevelos, treifos, shkatzim, v'ramasim, it's not going to work because I'm already adjured, right? I'm already obligated not to do that. Aval zeh she'amar lo ochal stam. Kolal dvarim hamutarim ba'asurim yachad, umigo dechayl shvuah al hamutarim chayl nami advarim asurim be'eser shvuah. So we'll say, so ultimately, again, it's very interesting. So therefore, what you have over here is, now this is the explanation of Rabbi Shimon's Shita. So Rav and Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan will all say that since the Shvuah devolves upon permitted items, it devolves upon the prohibited items as well. Reish Lakish says, the only way to set up this case is Elai b'mefaresh chatzi shir va'ali b'drabanan. So we'll say, could very well be, the way to set up this case to create liabilities as follows. Shvuah shelo ochal chatzi shir. I swear I will not eat even a partial amount, even a minute amount. Now, we'll say, interestingly enough, as much as there's a prohibition to eat, nevelos, treifos, shkatzim, v'ramasim, what's the isra achila? Kizayis. If you take a shvuah to eat less than a kizayis, then the shvuah could devolve upon that. Or again, it could be according to Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva holds that in general, an isra achila is an isra mashahu. So if you think that Rabbi Akiva generally holds like Rabbi Shimon, so the Gemara says, Kol shuhu nami mushba v'omer sinaihu. Then Rabbi Akiva would hold that there's an isra achila v'mashu in any area of Torah. If that's the case, you're mushra v'omer, you're already adjured. You're already obligated not to eat even a small amount. If that's the case, then the shvuah should not devolve upon it. Elalav shmamina ba'alma kirabanan sfirle shmamina. Rather, we'll say, what do you see from here? Rabbi Akiva does not hold like Rabbi Shimon in Gan's Torah. Rather, in general, he holds like the Rabbanos. Therefore, I will say the conclusion of the sugya, and there's a lot of interesting nuggets of information we picked up along the way, but remember, let's stay focused on task. What was our question? Rabbi Akiva said in the Mishnah, I swear not to eat this loaf of bread. I take a little crumb of the bread. Rabbi Akiva says, I am liable. So the Gemara says, now the Gemara asks, Rabbi Akiva, is that your position that you're chayiv for mashu just in Shevuos? Or you hold that in general halachas, in all these surei achila. Now, there is a position that holds an isser mashahu in all prohibited consumption. That is the position of Rabbi Shimon. So it's stated otherwise. Our question is, does Rabbi Akiva hold like Rabbi Shimon in the entire Torah, or just Shevuah? Conclusion, just Shevuah. What's the logic there? The logic of Rabbi Akiva is, since by Shevuah, you can stipulate a mashahu, so therefore we create that as the default, that any isra achila by shvuah will always be a mashu, a minute amount. But in all other cases of the Torah, where there is a prohibition of eating, the shear is kizayis. Beautiful. That's the end. Part 1 of today's shir. Good. Next. Amrlo Rabbi Akiva, Heicha Matzino. So I'll say, so they said back to Rabbi Akiva, so now remember, this exchange continues in the Mishnah. So the Mishnah said to Rabbi Akiva, how could it be that you're chayiv for a mashu? So Rabbi Akiva goes back and says to them, listen, Chevra, Shevuah is fundamentally different than anything else. Why? He said, where else do we find b'medaber v'mevi karban? Right? Where else do we go ahead and we see that there is carbonic liability for speech? Generally, carbonic liability comes as a result of what? Action. Where do you see that there's carbonic liability for speech? So what Rabbi Akiva was trying to point out, Shevuah is just fundamentally different than other things in the Torah. So the Gemara says as follows, V'lo, is it not true? I'm sorry. Rabbi Akiva said actually his lashon was, I'm sorry, they said, before we get to Rabbi Akiva, Amrlo, Heichad matzinu ba'ochal kol shehu shu chayiv. I'm sorry, they said, the Rabbanan said back to Rabbi Akiva, where do we ever find that there is liability for consumption of a minute amount of prohibited substance? Now the Gemara says, no. Follow? What about an ant? I want to say back to Ramakis days. Right? What about an ant? If you consume an ant, then halacha l'maisa again. Halacha l'maisa, which is a tiny item, you're chayiv. The Gemara says, no, that's not fair. Beria shiny. It's a beria. Remember, from Amakis days, it's its own self-contained entity. So because of that, because it's a creation, a fully formed creation, therefore it has a chashivas, even though it's very small. Bahari hagdish. What about hagdish? Rashi says over 4 lines from the bottom. Again, if you take hagdish and you misuse it, you're chayiv from misuse, even if it's less than a kizayis. To which the Gemara says that's true, but how about inon shava pruta? There's a different shear, right? The shear from Me'ilah is going to be a pruta's worth of use. I have a hari mefarish. What about mefarish? Now, most of the case of mefarish is where a person says, Shvuah she'eni ochel kikar zu, or mashu b'kikar zu. I explicitly say, I'm not going to eat a minute amount. So again, you see from here that the prohibition involves even a minute amount. The Gemara says, no, mefarish nami kiberia dami. Mefarish is different because mefarish is like beria, right? When you articulate something, so articulation makes it like an ant, makes it like a fully formed entity. Vahari afar. So we'll say this is interesting. What about the case of dirt? So look at Rashi, last Rashi on the daf. Haomer shvur shalo ochal afar. Person swears, I will not eat dirt. I won't eat dirt. So we'll say if a person says, I swear I won't eat dirt, the assumption is the shear is not a kizayis. That's what we're assuming, that the shear ultimately is even a kol shu. To which the Gemara says, Ella, top of Chaf Beis, Ella Tifshot the Bayrava. Rather, go ahead and explain this based on Mishnah. What happened? Or I should say, so the Gemara says, the Shevuos shelo ochal va'achal afar bekama. So listen to this. So the Gemara says, or Rava asked, if a person takes a Shevuah, I swear I'm not going to eat dirt. I'm sorry, Shevuos shelo ochal, excuse me. I swear I'm not going to eat. That's the Shevuah. I swear I'm not going to eat. Va'achal afar. And I ate dirt. Right? So my Shevuah didn't contain dirt. My Shevuah was just, I'm not going to eat. And then I end up eating dirt, bekama. How much dirt do you have to eat in order to be in violation of your Shevuah? So the Gemara says, Tifshot adi'ika kizayis. It would appear that the halacha should be that you have to consume a kizayis. To which the Gemara says, no. Ki kamina b'midi d'barachila kaminan. So ultimately, halacha l'maisa, the Gemara says, when is there a shir kizayis? Only by something that is a barachila. But it would appear to be that everybody would agree that by dirt, since dirt is not food, therefore any amount, there shouldn't be a shir kizayis, therefore consumption of any amount should make you in violation of your shvuah. To which the Gemara says, V'hari konamos. What about the case of konamos? Look at Rashi. V'hari konamos, third line down from the top. Rashi says, Kari konamos, ha'omer konam kikar zu alai, oser atzmo b'chol shehu sheva kidla kamana. So we're going to see now, konam is a vow. Konam is a vow. So if a person says, Konem kikar zu alai, right? Konem kikar zu alai. This loaf should be konam to me. What's talacha? They're chayiv for consumption of any amount. any amount, to which the Gemara says, so you see from here that there can be an Isra Achila even by a Mashu, to which the Gemara says, V'hari konamos nami kimefarish dami. So this is very interesting. A konam is different. A konam, so interesting, a konam is the equivalent of making a shvua b'mashahu. Now, why is that? Why is that? So Rashi points out something very interesting. The way a konam vow works is that a konam never mentions achila. Never mentions achila. So like the lashon of a konam is konam kikar zu alai. Right? This kikar should be konam to me. So because there is never a lashon of achila associated with it, therefore what? The isser is any amount. Shvua employs an isser, a lashon of achila. So because it employs lashon of achila, therefore again, it's possible to say that that there should be a shir of kizayis. Rabbi Akiva holds it's a kol shu because of mefarish, but everyone, it appears, will agree that by konam the shir is a kol shu because there is no mention of achila. Fascinating. Amar lan heicha matzinu b'medabra maybe carbon shezem medabra maybe carbon. So remember again, the Rabbanan challenged Rabbi Akiva because Rabbi Akiva, where do we ever find the case? Where do we ever find a situation where an isra achila is an isra kol shehu? Rabbi Akiva says, but Shevuos is different because where do we ever find the case of just speech which creates liability? Generally, it's action which creates liability, not just speech. So we see when this is an outlier case. The Gemara says, hello. Is that not true? That speech doesn't create liability? V'harei megadef. What about the blasphemer? The cursor Rashi says over here, megadef, mevarech es Hashem, the polyg Rabbi Akiva, the Rabbanan Bekrisos, var megadef may be carbon. So we'll say, so again, megadef is a person who chas v'shalom curses HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Rabbi Akiva holds that such a person is chayv a carbon. Now what did the megadef do? Speech. So you see from here that there is liability even just for speech. To which the Gemara says, no, medaber va'oser kamrinan. We're not talking about speech which generates liability by itself. We're talking about speech which assers something. Where Rabbi Akiva is saying to the Rabbanon, where do you ever find the case of speech which by itself creates prohibition? The Gemara says, 1 second, v'hai medaber v'chotu, but the megadef, his speech creates liability. Doesn't necessarily create anything aser. V'hari nazir. What about Nazir? So Nazir seems to be a good example. A person undertakes a neder naziros, and as a result of that neder naziros, he has to bring a carbon at the end of the duration of his Nazirite vow. To which the Gemara says, maybe diburu al karbono kamrinan. I'm sorry, maybe karbono al diburu kamrinan. The Gemara says, no. We're talking about someone who has to bring a carbon as a result of his speech. That's not why Nazir brings a carbon. Bahai. Maybe carbon lishtariye lechamrohu dekamaisi. Why does the Nazir bring a carbon? The Nazir's carbon is not related to his utterance. The Nazir's carbon is a matir, right? That carbon allows him to continue to drink wine. So what Rabbi Akiva is saying is Shevuos is unique because where do we ever find the case where your speech generates carbonic liability? So Rabbi Akiva is trying to say just like Shevuos is unique in that way, so too Shevuos is going to be unique in that it creates an Isser b'mashahu. I have a Hari Hagdish. What about the case of Hektish? So I'll say, so again, a person makes something Hektish. So what happens in the moment that he makes it Hektish? Halacha l'maaseh, again, there's a prohibition. And again, Rashi points out over here, if he were to go ahead and, let's say, benefit from the Hektish, he'd be chayev a carbon me'ilah. So you see from here again, his speech created a reality which also generates obligation for carbon. So it does two things. Number one, my speech prohibits something because by making something hektish, I aser it. And again, if I violate my speech, there is carbonic liability. To which the Gemara says, "Vare hektish osra liatzmo kamrinan v'hai osra kol ha'olam kulahu." So we'll say it's different. Hektish is different. Why? We're looking for a case where your speech creates prohibition, but only for you. In the case of hektish, when you make something hektish, I will say it makes it aser for everyone. So it's not a similar case. Hari konamos. What about the case of konam? Rashi says, Hari konamos, shelo asra ella alav, v'im achal mimenu kasagalaytcha demevi carbon me'ila, shakonim lashon hektishu. Because we're going to see, we'll talk about this more, but lashon of konam is lashon of hektish. So what about a konam? Right? I go ahead and say, konam kikars zualai. So again, there's a case of speech which creates iser, and then could also create carbonic liability. To which the Gemara says, no, kasavar. ein me'ila b'konamos. So this particular opinion holds that there's no me'ila by konamos. That as much as konam is like a lashon of hegdish, if you go ahead and you use it, there's not an isra me'ila. Okay? Amar Rava says as follows: Machlokes b'stam. Machlokes b'stam. Ava b'mefaresh divrei hakol b'choshu. So this Rabbi comes along. Now we're looping back a little bit to the Machlokes Rabbi Kiva and the Rabbanon before, right? So let's go through this. I say Shevuos shelo ochal kikarzu, right? I swear that I will not eat this loaf of bread, and now I eat a little piece of it, less than the kizayis. What's the halacha? Rabbi Akiva says I'm chayiv for violating my shvuah. The Rabbanon say that I'm pater. Rava comes along and says that the Machlokes is only in a case of stam, where I just say Shevuos shelo ochal. Right, and I did not define how much. I didn't give a shear to my achila. Aval b'mefaresh, but again, if I explicitly articulate and I say Shevuos shelo ochal mashahu b'kikarzu, I swear I'm not going to eat any amount. Divrei hakol b'choshu. Everyone will agree in that situation that halacha l'maisa I'm chayiv for consumption of any amount. So the Gemara says, my time. But what's the reason for that? Because again, we just mentioned this before actually, because when you articulate something, that makes the mashu like a beria. And just like this chiyuv a beria, even right, you're chayiv for eating an ant, even though again it's tiny, but l'maisa because it's a self-contained entity, so too when you articulate a mashu and a shvuah, the mashu becomes like a beria. V'amarava. So what's v'amarava? Rava says as follows. He says, machlokes b'shelo ochal. Furthermore, again, the machlokes ultimately, again, the machlokes Rabbi Kiva and the Rabbanon is when I say shelo ochal. Shevuos shelo ochal kikarzu. Rabbi Akiva says mashu. The Rabbanon say kizayis. Listen to this. Aval b'shelo et om divrei hakol b'choshu. Oh, listen to this. Let's say I make a shvuos. I bless you. I say a shvuos she'eni toem kikarzu. I swear I will not taste this loaf of bread. So interestingly enough, the Rava says everyone agrees in that case that you're chayiv hakol shehu, right? Because tasting by there's the ti'ima and achila. So ti'ima is a kol shehu, right? Ti'ima by definition is any amount. Achila is more substantive. So the Gemara says pshita. Okay, that's kind of obvious. You might have thought, in other words, what's the havamina? I might have thought like this. That really, when people say taste, what do they mean? What do they mean? Right? Eat. Right? Many a meal has begun just by tasting something, right? Another, just a little taste, a little lick, right? A little taste. So again, I might have thought that just like in the vernacular, tasting means eating. Kamash no. Kamash that halacha. No, in halacha, ti'ima means ti'ima. I will say, that's why, by the way, you should just know, just even in Hilchos Brachas, right? There's a lot of interesting halachic literature. You have to make a bracha before tasting something, right? Again, what are you allowed to taste something on a fast day? Is ti'ima called achila? Again, so the Gemara says over, at least by shvuah, Rava says everyone will agree that if I just say shvuah she'eni toem, then the prohibition is upon a mashu. Incredible. Amra Papa. So Papa says as follows. I just want to point out that the Rambam adopts these two statements of Rava. So just important to understand that halacha l'maisa, that we're going to paskin in general that when you take a shvuah, I mean, we'll see it. We'll get to it in Meretz Hashem. That halacha l'maisa in the shvuah case, you're chayiv. Well, we'll see in the shvuah case if it's a kizayis or a mashu. We'll come back to that. But in these two sub-cases, everyone agrees that if I say, Shevuos she'eni ochel mashehu b'kikarzu, that the prohibition is on any amount, right? Furthermore, everyone also agrees that if I say, Shevuos she'eni toem kikarzu, that the prohibition is on any amount. Okay, let's go weiter. Says, Amra Papa, machlokes b'shvuos. Furthermore, the machlokes Rabbi Kiva and the Rabbanon is only by Shevuos. However, aval b'konamos divrei hakol b'kolshu. But everyone agrees that in a konam case, in konamos, that the prohibition is upon any amount. The Gemara says, what's the reason for that? My timer. Konamos nami keban delo kamid kashma da'achila kidim efarish nami. We mentioned this before. Because also when it comes to a konam, because a konam vow, right, a neder, does not include any mention of achila. So because it doesn't mention achila, therefore the prohibition is upon a mashu, any amount. So is that true? Basically, where is the kasha? Shnei konamos mitzdarfin. So it's a very interesting case. So let's say again, I go ahead and I make two konam vows, right, on two different loaves. Konam kikar zualai, konam kikar zualai. What's talacha? mitzdarfin. If I eat a little bit from loaf 1 and a little bit from loaf 2, they come together to form the shear of kizayis. On the other hand, shtei Shevuos, if I say Shevuos she'eni ochal kikar zu, Shevuos she'eni ochal kikar zu, 2 Shevuos on 2 loaves, ein mitzdarfin. They do not combine. They do not combine. Rabbi Meir says, konamos keshvuos. Rabbi Meir says, no, a konam is just like a shvua. And just like shvuos don't combine, so too konamos don't combine. Meir says, 1 second. Why do you need to combine konamos? If we just said before, the Rabbi said that an Isser konam is an Isser mashahu. If it's an Isser mashahu, then why the need to combine it with anything? Which the Gemara says, the Amar, Achila mizo alai konam, right? The Amar achila mizu alai konam, achila mizu alai konam. Oh, because the guy goes out of his way to use the word achila in the konam vowel. Okay, the default setting of a konam doesn't include the word achila. Therefore, the isra is mashahu. If you include the word achila in your konam vowel, then bepashtas the halacha interprets that to mean you want it to be the shear of a kizayis. If that's the case, amay mitzdarfos. Right, I don't understand still why is it misaref? Why does it combine? Sof, zil hachalek ashira, v'zil hachalek ashira. There's still two different konamos. So because there's still 2 different konamos, why should they combine at all? The Amar, achila mishtehen alai konam. So I'll say interestingly enough, because the way he says it in his lashon is that consumption from both of them should be konam to me. And therefore again they combine. First wide line, the kavase gabi Shevuos, damer Shevuos lo ochal mishtehen. So I'll say, okay, so what would be the parallel case by Shevuah? I swear I will not eat from either of these loaves. If that's the case, amay in mitzdarfin, why do they not combine? To which the Gemara says, Amra Pinchas, shani Shevuos mitoch shechalukos lechatos, in mitzdarfos. So Pinchas says like this. So ultimately, again, since by Shvuah, they do not combine for carbonic liability, they will also not combine for shear liability. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, mitoch shechalukos lechatos, mitoch sheshtei kikaros halalu chashuvos shtayim le'inyin chatos b'shvuah zu, im amar shvuah shelo ochal mizu umizu. So we'll say again, if I make a shvuah, I say, I swear I will now eat from this one and from this one, since there's different chatos liability, therefore halacha l'maisa, they do not combine. If that's the case, Rabbi Meir Omer, konamos kishvuos. So what about Rabbi Meir, right? Rabbi Meir says that a konam is like a shvuah. So bishlam shvuos hol bechalukos lechatos. So I understand why shvuos don't combine. Right? Why not? Why don't they combine? Because halacha l'maisa, since there is distinction for carbonic liability, they don't combine. Ela konamos amailo, but for konamos, why do they not combine? So which the Gemara says, Epoch, rather switch around the shitas. Rabbi Meir Omer, Shvuos ki konamos, but less Rabbi Pinchas. So Rabbi Meir holds Shvuos are like konamos, and ultimately, again, he does not hold like Rav Pinchas. Okay, Ravina says, Ki kam Rav Papa, when did Rav Papa spouse his shita? Le'inyan Malkus. For Malkus purposes, Ki tanya hahi, when do they make this last statement? Le'inyan carbon, Tebainan shave pruta. Ultimately, again, I will say, so it could very well be that for Malkus, you'll be chayiv in a kol shehu, but ultimately, again, by carbon, you require some higher shear. Okay, either again, if we're talking about me'ilah, it's shave pruta, and if it's by achila, it's going to be a kizayis. Incredible. L'meimra, the savi rabbanon yesh milah b'konamos. Is that to say that the rabbanon hold that there is me'ilah by a konam? Remember again, konam is a neder, but konam is a lashon of hegdish. So when a person says konam kikar zu alai, essentially what he's doing is he's creating a hektish reality. The shaila is that real hektish or is that not hektish? Right? In other words, maybe it's not real hektish. It means that it's usher for me, but it's not real hektish. What's the nafkamina? The nafkamina will be, is there an isra me'ilah? If you use something very like konam, have you violated me'ilah? So the Gemara says, are we to say that the Rambanan hold ultimately again yesh me'ilah b'konamos, that there is me'ilah? But time we learned kikar zu hektish va'achla. If I say this kikar is hektish and then I eat it, right? Va'achla bein hu bein chavero mal. So we'll say if I make a loaf of bread hektish and then whether I eat it or someone else eats it, halacha l'maisa, there's me'ilah. Lefichach yesh lapidyon. And because there is me'ilah, that shows that what it's real, it's hektish. And because this hektish can also be redeemed. Kikar zu alai hektish, Harehu ma'al chaver lamal. However, Rabbi say, if I say this kikar is hektish to me, essentially what I'm doing is I'm creating a personal prohibition, but that's not real hektish. Therefore, what? Harehu ma'al chaver lamal. If I use it, okay, I've committed mi'ilah, but not my friend, because the prohibition never devolved upon it for him. Lefichach ein lapiyan divrei meir. Therefore, again, because of that, because it's not real hektish, therefore, halacha l'maisa, it doesn't have pidyon. It doesn't have redemption. Divrei meir. These words are meir. I'll say, I'm a base. Chacham the chum say, bein hu, bein chavero lo ma'al. The chum say, no, neither me nor my friend committed mi'ilah. Why? Lefi she'ein mi'ilah b'konamos. Because ultimately, again, there is no mi'ilah by konam vow. No mi'ilah by konamos. So we'll say it's conscious we just said before. Epoch, changing our switch on the sheet, this echazeh ve'echazeh lo ma'al. Neither party committed mi'ilah. Why? Lefi she'ein mi'ilah b'konamos. Because Rameir holds that there is no mi'ilah by konamos. The chum say hu ma'al, the chaver lo ma'al. Chum say no. He, the person who uttered the konam, has mi'ilah. His friend does not. Ihachi, if that's the case, Rabbi Meir Omer konamos kishvuos, that a konam is like a shvua. Ela konamos itztarufehu d'lo mitztarfei ha mi'ilah ispu. So it could very well be that a konam, like a shvua, doesn't combine, right? Two konamos don't combine for a shear. However, again, there is mi'ilah. Ivan Rameir ein mi'ilah b'konamos klal. Ibrahim Meir himself holds that there is no mi'ilah by konamos. L'divreim d'Rabbanan kamar lahu. So ultimately, again, Rabbi Meir is speaking in accordance with the position of the Rabbanan. Lididi ein mi'ilah b'konamos klal. According to me, Rabbi Meir says, I hold there is no mi'ilah by konamos, because konam, as much as konam kind of employs some of the mechanisms of hektish, it's not real hektish. Because it's not real hektish, therefore there's no mi'ilah. That's according to me. Ledidach, according to you, Rabbanan, oduli mihas de konamos kishvuos. At least agree with me that a konam is like a shvua. For Rabbanan, shvuos ika dra pinchas, konamos like a dra pinchas. Ultimately, Rabbanan will hold, ultimately, again, in a case of shua, they hold the dra pinchas. In a case of konamos, they don't hold the dra pinchas. Okay, so we'll say, so again, bottom line, what do we glean over here? So we'll say, so first of all, again, interestingly enough, as much as we have not done the sugya of konamos yet, we're picking up like a lot of interesting facts about konamos. A konam, which is a neder, creates an isser b'mashahu, right? Why does it create an isser b'mashahu? And everybody seems to agree with that. Why is that? Because a konam vow does not use the lashon of achila. So because it doesn't use achila, therefore Allah it answers mashu. Now, if you use the lashon of achila in a konam, then it's possible that the shear ultimately again becomes a kizayis. If you make a konam vow, does that create a prohibition of mi'ilah? Machlokes. And again, that we still have to resolve. So we've got konam, and just remember again, in everything else, we still have our machlokes about shvua. When you say shvua shelo ochal kikar zu. So again, Rabbanan, shir kizayis, Rabbi Akiva, shir kol shehu. However, everyone agrees that if halacha l'maisa I say shvua she'eni ochal mashu bekikar zu, that the prohibition of the shua devolves even upon a mashu. So again, the machlokes Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanan is still hovering here in the background. We'll have to resolve it. Let's go a little bit weiter. Amar Rava. Rava says as follows: Shvu shelo ochal va'achal afar. Once we had this case before. I swear, I make a shvua that I will not eat. General shvua I won't eat, and I eat dirt. What's the halacha? Pater. I'm pater. I both say, why am I pater? Because the assumption over here is that the consumption of dirt is not called eating. That's not called eating. Therefore, I'm pater. By Rava. Rava says, Shvu shelo ochal afar bekama. So Rava asks a different kash. Okay, I understand that first case. What if I say, I swear I won't eat dirt? I won't eat dirt, right? So we'll say, so now, and I eat, what's the, and let's say I eat dirt. How much dirt do I have to eat in order to be liable? Bekama. Kevan da amar shelo ochal daiti akizayis. So on one hand, since I use the lashon achila, so maybe what lashon achila means what? Akizayis. Oh Dilma, kevan delav midi da'achli inshihu b'chol. Or maybe since dirt is not something that people eat, therefore again halacha l'maisa it's more like a kol shuhu case. So also see here, you hear the shaila. So maybe we could say since again I use lashon of achila, therefore the shear should be a kizayis. On the other hand, since it's not a food item, maybe the shear should be kol shuhu. To which the Gemara says teku. Not sure. Not sure. Next, another question. By Rava, Shvuos shelo ochal chartzon bekama. Listen to this. I take a shvua not to eat. Chartzon is a grape seed. I swear I'm not going to eat a grape seed. So the Gemara says bekama. So what's the shear? What's the shear for violation? Kevan de misachal ayidei taruves daite akizayis. Since in general both sides people don't eat grape seeds on their own, but rather again, when do you eat a grape seed? When do you eat a grape seed? In a grape. In a grape as part of a larger unit of consumption. So perhaps the shear is a kizayis. Oh, Dilma, kevan de lo beine achlile inshi adaite amashu. On the other hand, since people, you're right, don't generally eat a grape seed by itself, yet I made a shvua not to eat a grape seed. Perhaps the shear over here is mashahu, to which the Gemara answers, teku, not sure. Boy Ravashi. Nazir Sha'amar, suppose another case. Nazir Sha'amar Shvuos shelo ochal chartzon. Suppose an interesting case over here. A Nazir. Nazir says, I swear I will not eat a grape seed. Bekamo. Suppose say ultimately again, what is the shear? What is the shear ultimately again for prohibition in this case? The Gemara says, Bekamo. The chayvan the kizayis yisur d'oraisuhu ki kamishtaba hatira kamishtaba. And I was saying, here's what's interesting. Remember, a Nazir is already prohibited from eating grape seeds. You already can't eat it. So remember again, in general, a shvua does not devolve upon something already prohibited. So perhaps we'll say like this. In general, a Nazir is asr on kizayis. So when a Nazir makes a shvua, perhaps that shvua devolves upon what? Even a mashu, even a very small amount. Atira kamishtaba v'daite mashu. Ol dilma, kevan damer shelo ochal. On the other hand, since he used lashon of achila, so maybe his das is for what? Maybe his das will still be for a kizayis. Now, both say. Rashi points out over here, if his das is for a kizayis, then what? Then what? Then the shvua is meaningless, right? Why is the shvua meaningless? Why? Because he's already prohibited. So that's the shaila, right? So again, a Nazir says shvua she'eni ochel chartzon. So what is he saying? Do we say chartzon means mashahu? And therefore, again, this shvua works because he's prohibiting something that he is not yet prohibited in. Or conversely, no, chartzon means kizayis. He's already usher in kizayis, and therefore the shvua is invalid. Or is void. So tashma shvua shelo ochal v'achal nevelos shevas shkatzim v'ramasim chayiv. So the Rav says, go back to our previous case. I swear I won't eat. And I end up eating non-kosher items. What's the halacha? Chayiv. I'm chayiv. So Tanakam, the Rabbanan say chayiv. Rabbi Shimon poter. Rabbi Shimon says I'm poter. But we asked about this case. Am I chayiv? Why should I be chayiv? Mushba va'omen mehar sinahu. I'm already prohibited to go ahead and eat these items. In other words, there's already a prohibition upon me. To which the Gemara says, Rav Ushmov Rabbi Yochanan Darmi Bekol Dvarim HaUtarim Im Dvarim HaAsurim. So the case of Osa is, no, the reason why the shvua works is like this. Since the shvua she'eni ochel devolves upon permitted items, it also devolves upon prohibited items. That's the concept of what we call an Isser Kolal. It's inclusive. Therefore, again, when I say shvua shelo ochel and I eat nevelas treifa shkatzim v'ramasim, I'm going to be chayiv. The Gemara says, Reb Shlakish Amar, iya tamotze ele ibim mefarish shachatzi shir v'aliva d'Rabbanan, ibistam v'aliva d'Rabbi Akiva, the Amar Adam Oser. Bechoshu. You know what? Actually, we're going to stop over here. We're going to stop over here at the Tashma. We're not going to rush through it. We'll stop over here at the Tashma. So we'll say, so again, remember, we're leaving off in this last case of Rava. Nazir goes ahead and says, Shvuos shelo ochal chartzon, I will not eat a grape seed. What does that mean? Does that mean the Nazir is making a shvua on a kol shehu, in which case the shvua works? Or no, chartzon means kizayis, in which case the shvua doesn't work because the Nazir is already prohibited in the kizayis. In Meretz Hashem resolution tomorrow. Shkoyach. All right, Chevron Zoom. A good Shabbos, everyone. Good Shabbos.